2:09 at BBC Tees. Now, you can say many good things about this show. One of the things you can say is the After Two guests. Put it this way, if you were to line them all up, eclectic wouldn't even cope with it, because we have people from all over the place, all different walks of life coming onto the show. Hopefully the common bond is they're either from or have spent some time in the northeast. Malcolm Guite is our guest this afternoon. Malcolm, thank you very much for coming in at short notice, because we saw this and we got in touch with the PR people at Durham Cathedral, and we thought this could be, really interesting.
It's great to be here. I'm delighted to find myself in sunny Middlesbrough. In sunny Middlesbrough with a cup of tea, chatting with a man in a plaid shirt, There you go.
Well, there you are, you see. What more could you want? We said a poet and a priest. That's a couple of strings to you, but that's like the full-time work that you do. But there are other things in the backstory to you as well, and I got a feeling about this hour that it's going to be a really, really good hour. I mean, you live down south, but you did spend a number of years up in the northeast, and that's one of the reasons why you are back at the moment.
Yes, that's why I'm back at the moment. In fact, I did my first degree. I was in the south. I was in Cambridge, but I'd always had a pull northwards. I think partly because, my mum's a Scotswoman and my father's a Yorkshireman, so the northeast is a good compromise between those two.
Halfway.
To meet halfway. But in fact, I came up to Newcastle in 1981-82 to train as a teacher. I did my PGC, as it's called, and I did my teaching practices in Prudhoe, I think, and I learnt a lot from that's for sure. So I did teaching, and I loved it up here. I just loved it. So I kind of had good memories. And then when I came, while I was a teacher, to do a part-time PhD, I wanted to get that done, and somehow in between all the classes. Again, I found the draw of Durham, and there was a very good English department here, and they would let you do things part-time. So I did a part-time PhD over many years, I have to say. It was from like 86 to 92 or something like that.
You took your time.
Yeah. But it meant that every term, although I was living in Cambridge, I would have the excuse to come up a couple of times, that glorious train ride, look out across at the cathedral, make my way, have my lessons and my supervisions, and then just go and pay my respects to Cuthbert and Bede, and it just kept the northeast sort of ticking in my mind. And after I got married, of course, lo and behold, it turned out that my wife had been a Durham girl. She'd been at university here and done her PhD, and so she's a vicar too. So we realised one day we're going to run out of vicarages. There's not going to be a roof over our head. So we thought, well, we love to holiday in the northeast, and that's where we're going to settle. And we'll perhaps come and do some work in the church here for our final bit. But I reckon we're going to come back up here and put our roots down when the time comes.
Coming to retire back to the northeast.
So I got this invitation from St John's College in Durham. I've got a sabbatical break. It's just one term where I can revel in reading and writing and not do all the other things I do. And St John's kindly wrote to me. They had this Ruth Etchells Fellowship. She was a great woman who ran the St John's College and loved to bring the different worlds of literature and theology together. And that is exactly what I do. That's my gig, as it were. So they said, why don't you come up and stay with us for a month and a half and get on with your own work, but also, enthuse our students for us. And I said, I'd be happy to do that. And then, sort of icing on the cake, from my point of view, the cathedral then said, well, why don't you come and read some of your poetry in the cathedral itself, which is what I did last night. And I'm still on the high from that. It was just magical. There is something about you today. You're bouncing from foot to foot almost, with excitement. Because of course you are in the church. There can be no better place, really, can there, than Durham Cathedral? It's one of the most amazing places on earth, I think. There's something about... it's not just the beautiful position and the wonderful architecture and all that sort of thing. Actually, I think there's something about Bede and Cuthbert, something about everything they mean. I mean, I love Reading Bead and Stories of Cuthbert move me. But the fact that they're both, as it were, the shrines, you know, the relics, they're
there.
Physically there. And I sometimes feel it's almost like the poles of a magnet, you know, because they're at either end of the cathedral. And you can feel this kind of almost field of energy between these two great characters. So that's hugely attractive. And that sense of sheer continuity, if you think of all the, you know, ideas and isms and political parties and this and that have risen and fallen and gone back to the dust. And all the time, Durham's just sat there in the cathedral with these two great saints, like a sort of magnet.
Wow.
It's wonderful.
And, you know, there was a good crowd there last night.
There was, yeah. It was, considering, you know, foggy Monday night in Durham. Yeah, no, it was pretty good. We had probably had about 50 people gathered in the choir to listen to poetry, and which is pretty good. Though perhaps the prospect of wine afterwards and the prayers. My view is I spend so much time turning wine into poetry, I might as well turn poetry back into wine
Just every now and again.
Yeah.
Just let you make sure you can still do it. I mean, that's what you've got to do, haven't you? Mm. Well, let's find out a bit more about you and this pull that Durham has, and about last night, and why, having trained as a teacher, you decided to go to the church, and then this love of poetry that's come through as well, and especially on today of all days, with it being Armistice Day.
Yeah.
And there is so much poetry that has gone round because of conflict.
Absolutely.
People seem to have found a bit of solace in writing poetry at a time of need.
That's right. You know, I mean, well, you know, Wilfred Owen famously said, you know, that his subject was war and the pity of war. And people wanted him to be all poetic in a sort of false way about it, instead of writing, you know, that vivid stuff where he said, you know, bent double like old beggars under sacks, we trudge through filth, you know. People say, oh, that doesn't sound... But he said, powerful thing, he said, the poetry is in the pity. My subject is war and the pity of war, the poetry is in the pity. So I think this is a time when poetry comes to the fore. And in some ways, I think the poetry, particularly the poetry that was written in the Great War, takes you closer to the vivid experience than any documentary or docudrama will ever do.
Okay, let's talk about that when we come back at BBC TT. And I know, well, it's like when we've had musicians in before guitarists, we've always brought the guitar in. You're a poet, you've brought some poetry in. We'll do a bit of that this afternoon, 16 minutes past 2 at BBC Tees.
Do you remember when we used to sing?
This is BBC Tees, 20 past 2. Our guest today is Malcolm Guite, poet and priest, who is, yes, from the south, but did teacher training here in Durham. His wife is a Durham lass as well. Who's also a vicar. The church, we're going to talk about that, because we've just had a little chat off the air while we've been listening to Van Morrison about that, and that's an amazing little story which we want to touch upon. Why Van Morrison? I remembered to ask you.
Van the man, I've always loved Van Morrison, and that particular song, I guess it's his most famous, Brown Eyed Girl, but that question, do you remember when? Do you remember when we used to do these things, you know, way back? And there's something about recollection of the past. You can have an experience, and at the time you don't get quite how good it is or quite how much it's going to mean to you. But you look back, and suddenly the whole thing is all lit up with kind of golden light that you didn't quite see at the time. And a lot of poets, I mean, Wordsworth probably most famously writes about that, but Van has got that in spades. I mean, Van has got that sort of... what he calls, in another song, the childlike vision leaping into view. And I love Van. He's also got a line in one of his songs which is "Rave on John Donne," and I'm a big fan of John Donne, and he's the only rock and roll person I've heard that ever mentioned John Donne, so I've got to be in with that.
What is it about words?
Well, they're magical things, aren't they? If you think about it, it's just a sound in the air, or a shape on paper. It's a thing in itself. And yet, 3 or 4 words, just these tiny little things, can sum up a whole world in people's minds, take them to, you know, the brink of ecstasy or the edge of horror. Just language. It's a magical thing. I think there's no mistake that the word spell in the dullest and most boring learning to spell at school word is also the word spell, as in magical spell. casting a spell, and in some sense, with words, you cast a spell by first learning how to spell, or you enchant by chanting, might be another way of putting it.
Because as we said, I mean, it says here on the press release that we got about a poet and priest who studied in Durham, is returning to give the talk. It seems an odd combination. Or does it? I mean, you mentioned John Donne there a moment ago. Which came first then for you? Was it the church or was it being a poet?
I think poetry came first in the sense that I loved poetry since I was quite little, and when I was in my late teens and I sort of started reading the Romantic poets and John Keats, I thought, I want to be that. So the priesthood thing came later, but it came very clearly, but it came partly through study. I was brought up as a Christian as a child, but like many people, I kind of rejected it in my teens and thought I'd been through that and thought it was, fairy stories, and did my best to be a sort of dogged atheist. But the more I grew and the more I thought and the more I reflected on the depth we have in our own souls, I realised that just thinking we're all unwinding enzymes wasn't going to be ultimately a good way of accounting for the mystery of things. Eventually, I came back to faith in my final year, but I never thought I'd be a vicar. I came up to Newcastle and trained as a teacher instead, because, I was a long-haired guy. I rode a motorcycle, played in a band. I didn't see any vicars like me. I didn't see any vicars who cared about poetry. But it was when I started the PhD, which I came up part-time to Durham, I did it about John Donne, who was an amazing poet in the late 16th, early 17th century, who also became a priest. And indeed, he was the Dean of St. Paul's. And he was both a great love poet and religious poet and a great preacher. And when I looked at his life, and there was a kind of wholeness in it, and it wasn't in any way, sort of set aside or artificial or kind of prissy or cosy, which I'm sorry to say were things that sometimes I did associate with the church. Sure. And so that's part of what made me feel I could do this and God might be calling me to do this. And since, of course, I found others like George Herbert in that time, and of course in our own time, I mean, very famously, I suppose, R.S. Thomas is a great Welsh priest poet who combined those two things. I think priests and poets have got this in common, that they take something which you thought you knew, which you'd seen 100 times, like bread and wine or a view over the river, and by somehow raising it up and speaking in and through it, it becomes for a minute something more. I mean, the poet-priest George Herbert had a great line which we sing in a hymn where he goes, a man that looks on glass, on it may stay his eye, or, if he pleaseth, through it pass, and then the heavens espy. And I guess both priests and poets are in the business of suddenly clearing the glass so you can see through.
Do we take much on from poetry? I mean, you mentioned John Donne there, Wilfred Owen. It's all things that the majority of us have studied at school as part of our English language back in the day. And then we sort of like move away from it. But then at some point in our life, we'll come back to poetry and we'll appreciate it so much more. Yeah,
so much more. I mean, it partly does depend on how it's, done at school. In fact, the word done, I can remember an English teacher once saying, right, this term we're going to do poetry. And I thought, that's going to be like do it in, it's kind of,
You just heard the gasp from everybody.
I know, it's awful, there's kind of tie the poem up and beat it with a hose pipe till it confesses what it means. I mean, no. I think the best that can happen with poetry is when you kind of love just the sound, like people do with songs. You kind of fall in love with the language and it goes inside you. And then one day, a little phrase from a poem you might have read at school or somewhere else suddenly pops up into your mind when you're not thinking about it, you're doing something else, and it gives you a bit of clarity, it gives you a bit of a handle on something. I once had a conversation with the poet Seamus Heaney about this, and we were talking about how people don't remember whole poems anymore, but he said what people do remember is phrases, and he said this to me, he said, I hope that my poetry will sometimes offer people, and this was his phrase, phrases that feed the soul.
That's
just that
nice
little phrase. And I think that's what a lot of people get, from a Rudyard Kipling poem like If, or, even from the Wordsworth Daffodils or whatever. It's just a sudden phrase that comes. I mean, Shakespeare gives people lots of that for people. I mean, there's, everybody may not read all his love sonnets, but you can bet that there are phrases in his love sonnets that are still coming up and clarifying people's minds.
It's almost, to some people, though, like an underground movement.
Yeah.
Being a poet, would you readily confess to a lot of people that you are a poet? But again, at some point, we've all sat down and tried to scribe something, and it is becoming increasingly
It is,
popular.
yes, and in fact, it's returning to its roots in some way, because obviously poetry is older than writing. I mean, poetry began with kind of chanting and recitation and kind of remembering the tribal story. And because of, poetry slams and poetry events in pubs and performance poetry generally, there's a lot of people who are less interested in, having a nice book. I mean, I'm glad to have the book, and want to just make that sound in the air. And that's where you get these kind of rap poets and of course the beat poets in America in the 40s and 50s. So I think there is a bit of a revival. But you're right, it is an underground thing. Most people do in fact write or read some poetry, but they kind of keep it quiet. So I suppose I'd be part of a kind of poetry liberation.
You're part of the movement forward.
Yeah.
When did you first write your first poem then? When did you pick up the pen in anger?
Right.
And write the first one?
And
then go...
Oh, yeah, absolutely,
Rubbish.
yeah. I even wrote a whole poem about throwing away pieces of paper and scrapped poems, called Salvage. I think I first started writing when I was probably about 16 or 17, and it was really pretty mawkish, sort of splurgy stuff. But I think it's probably later, when I was about in my 20s, I got one or two poems where I thought, actually, this is a keeper. This is something I would share or could share if,
And that gives you the confidence to go on.
And then that gives you the confidence to go on. And then eventually, particularly if you get one or two things published and people come back to you and tell you things that have worked or that have helped them, then that gives you a great boost. And
as you said, I mean, it is something that you maybe might not know a whole poem, or it might be something that you remember the phrase, but it can be just 4 or 5 words put together, and as you said, it's somewhere else. It can make you feel an emotion. Yeah,
it's just like even the phrase. There's a line in a Shakespeare sonnet which goes, "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediment. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds." But just that phrase, the marriage of true minds. A lot of people have found that phrase incredibly helpful. It takes marriage in one sense, and it's suddenly that real meeting. So just that phrase might be something that clarifies something for people for a long time.
We've been looking at poetry the wrong way, haven't we, as a society? We should be looking at it in that sort of way, where it can take you to. Oh,
absolutely. I mean, poetry is about... I mean, the poet Coleridge, I'm working on a book on Coleridge at the moment, has this great phrase where he says what poetry does is it awakens the mind's attention from mere custom and habit. And then he talks about there's a film of familiarity. It's like a kind of dull... kind of veily film that we put over everything, and he says poetry peels that back and lets you see the wonder and the freshness of the thing as it is. No, that's not about learning some dumb thing in school because your teacher told you to. That's about getting total clarity now about where you are.
Getting inside. All right, it's 2:30 already. We're going to come back with Malcolm in just a moment, and you're going to read for us?
I am, yeah.
Okay. Tuesday afternoon, we'll do that in just a tick.
John Foster.
Weekdays from midday.
This afternoon, our guest between now and 3 is Malcolm Guite, poet and also priest as well. Does he look like a poet? Possibly. Does he look like a priest? Possibly not. We'll explain more in just a moment.
If you're talking about it, we're talking about it. BBC Tees.
Searching for a heart of gold. I've been a miner for a heart
of gold. Neil Young, Heart of Gold, at BBC Tees, with our guest today, who is Malcolm Guite. When we get the guests in, we always ask them to pick some songs. And I always say, we're going to ask you why you've picked that song. And then I always forget to ask because my mind is just racing with things. But I'm going to stop now and say, why Heart of Gold?
It's one of the great songs. It's basically to hear Neil Young. I love Neil Young. I like all of his stuff, not only the big hit there. I spent my early teenage years in Canada, in Hamilton, Ontario, and Neil had left by then, of course, and he was down in, LA, hanging out with Joni
I bet
Mitchell.
you went looking for him, though, didn't you?
Yeah, but
Neil?
something about that sound, that slightly shaky voice, that harmonica, is full of poetry, but it's also full of vulnerability. There's something about the way he sings that well, he's got a line about it where he talks about, you sing a song in a shaky voice that was real as the day is long. And I love Neil, so I would just like to hear him.
Poet and a priest. If I may say so, you don't look like your archetypal priest. You've alluded to the fact that you were in bands.
Yeah.
You're a motorbiker.
Yeah, I've got kind of long hair, grey now. Actually, I'm starting to look more and more like Father Christmas, to be honest. But
You've got
but it's a bit...
a wonderful silver hair, thatched silver hair, and a fantastic, it has to be said, an amazing beard.
Yeah. Actually, the beard's getting so long now that people can't see the dog collar under it anyway. But, yeah, they're not looking like a priestess, but sometimes got into trouble when riding on the bike. I can remember once turning up, I'd agreed to do a wedding at a church. It wasn't my usual church, but the couple particularly wanted me to do the wedding. So I turned up, half an hour early to get ready and make sure, and turned up on the motorbike in full leathers. And the church warden came out, and I thought, they've come out to greet me and explain to me where I can put my robes on. And I could see that by the time they got to the bike, they were really aggressive, and they just came and said,
Oi.
You can't park there. Do you know we've got a proper service going on here? That's reserved for the vicar. You just clear off, So by that time, I'd sort of unwrapped the scarf and off my chest. I said, I am the vicar.
They said.
Yeah, no, I don't. Of course, I don't think any of the things to do with what it is to be a Christian or a priest have got anything to do with appearances at all. I mean, there's a great line in the Bible in Paul where he says, we don't look to the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. The things that are seen are passing. So I think we should never judge anybody by their appearance.
Book by the cover.
Exactly so.
But having said that, I'm guilty of it, because when the security door went, we got a camera on the door, and I saw you there, long hair, flowing locks, big bushy beard and a hat on, and I thought, is that Malcolm? He doesn't look like my word. He doesn't look like a vicar.
Yeah,
and I was expecting somebody to come in with rich tea biscuits
exactly.
and a cup of tea.
That's right, a cucumber sandwich.
But as you said, it has given you one or two lighter moments.
It has indeed.
In your life, you've got a couple of sonnets there that you would like to read to us today.
It's partly because today is obviously Armistice Day. It's Remembrance Day, and I expect many of your listeners stood today for 2 minutes somewhere, just wherever they were, even if they weren't at a service in that silence. And I wanted to read you a poem about that silence, about standing in that, which I wrote, actually. I was at home a couple of years ago, and the silence came on the radio. Suddenly it stopped, and I found that very moving. So I read you that, and then I want to read you a little thing I actually wrote just on Sunday about being up in Durham. But let's start with this one. So we'll just call this Silence. November pierces with its bleak remembrance of all the bitterness and waste of war. Our silence tries, but fails, to make a semblance of that lost peace they thought worth fighting for. Our silence seethes instead with wraiths and whispers and all the restless rumour of new wars, for shells are falling all around our vespers. No moment is unscarred. There is no pause. In every instant, bloodied innocence falls to the weary earth. And whilst we stand, quiescence ends again in acquiescence, and Abel's blood still cries from every land. One silence only might redeem that blood. Only the silence of a dying God.
There's rhythm and there's rhyme in there as well.
Yeah.
What reaction do you get when you read that to an audience?
Well, I find I get
incredibly powerful words.
Funnily enough, that particular poem has had more response, and I have a blog and I put all the poems on it, and I read them on it. And of all the ones I've ever put up, that one, the first year I put that up, I had hits from all. But I was I had a lot of things from Afghanistan and from Iraq, as well as from Germany, and I realised that some serving soldiers had obviously got onto this and were sort of going onto the site and reading it. And I think one of the things that people find helpful, it's accessible because it's got the rhythm and rhyme and it brings you through. But I think everybody's locked into that silence in their own thoughts. And I think everybody's thinking, oh God, it's still going on. I'm trying to do something, but it's still going on. And I think it was just expressing that for people. And of course, for some people, the turn at the end, you're bound to say, well, where's God in all of this? All this bloody suffering, where is he? And I'm very quietly alluding at the end of that poem to God on the cross, which many of the soldiers in the First World War felt as well. If anybody knew what they were going through, it was the man who was nailed to a tree,
What's the other one?
Well, I was at the big service in Durham in the cathedral on Sunday, which was magnificent, and we stood and there was a sign, and there were all the uniformed organisations, and there were Last Post and Reveille, and then there was a great parade through the town. It was very moving, actually, because from where I was standing, I could see some young men in uniform with tears in their eyes in that silence. For them, obviously, they were remembering particular friends and perhaps battles they'd been in. But afterwards, I went down, and just in the early afternoon, to sit by the banks of the Weir, and it was, you wouldn't have known it was Remembrance. It was just a beautiful day. The light was out, and there were people fishing just below the bench where I was sitting. And I suddenly thought, some of those lads that we remembered, some of the ones that marched off to the First War and beyond, must have been from here. They must have fished this very spot. And this just very peaceful Sunday afternoon fishing suddenly seemed to me to be changed a bit with the sense of what it had cost, that's something that they defended.
The ghosts of yesterday.
Yeah. So I wrote this and actually read it in the cathedral last night. So this is literally the most recent thing I've ever written. It's called Remembrance Sunday Afternoon.
Okay.
So, November sunlight shimmers on the Weir. Wide waters slip unhurried by each bank and soothe Remembrance Sunday afternoon. After the service, after the parades, after the poppies, after the last post, I sit and drink in quietness and peace. The peace those Durham infantry forsook to keep it sacred for the likes of me. Some of them surely fished this very spot where Durham fishermen are sitting still on folded camp stools. May those fallen men whom we remembered in the high cathedral drink deep now from the river of true life, where all their wounds are healed, where living light flows from the source of every time and tide. And may they know that we remember them.
How long did that take to write?
Well, after it's about 5 minutes. I mean, I revised it a little bit, but I just sat on the bench and I jotted it down more or less. I mean, it's in blank verse, it's in rhythm. It's got every line has 5 beats, as it were. So it's written in a particular form, but not in the intricate sonnet form. But it just flowed. It was just what I was feeling. So I tidied it up a little bit and, counted up the syllables, but essentially I wrote that.
Isn't that odd in nearly anything that is creative process, whether it be poetry or writing music, once you have the passion of seeing something that gets inside you, it appears.
Yeah, that's right, it appears. So that one appeared. I mean, I have had poems that I've wrestled with, for weeks, but I'd say that one, and in fact the first one as well, the other more intricate sonnet one that I wrote, both of those poems came very quickly. And partly because I'm used to thinking in that form. I love the metre. There's a written in what's called iambic pentameter, which is just basically 5 beats to the bar. Yeah. As long as there's a bar, I'm happy. But anyway, I kind of almost think in iambic pentameter now, so I know I can produce a line of it without sort of having to stop and count the syllables.
It's amazing.
Sense,
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And the thought, provoking nature of something like that. And especially on today of all days. Yeah. If I may, we'll take the travel in just a minute. As a man of the church, when today comes round, what's your view on war and the horror of war? Because the church itself played an incredibly important part during those wars and during every other war as well.
Yeah. I think... Well, Jesus said Jesus asked his disciples to put their swords away and said, if you live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. And I think the way that Jesus has shown is not the way of war. And I think he's set an example which, in some senses, we have yet to follow. So I think there's a very strong strong command on the church, really, to do and pursue and build the things that make for peace. However, there is a however, because one of the things you learn very quickly if you're a priest, and if you're a priest who's tending pastorally to an army family, is the incredible courage and commitment, and actually an almost lost sense of honour that you don't get in wider society, that's still preserved in the services. And I don't think, however strongly I believe that war should be a last resort or not a resort at all, I'm very, very aware that actually the real service and commitment and courage of those people is pretty extraordinary. And generally speaking, I have to say, I think the role in peacemaking and the role in dealing with making places more livable in, and dealing with danger and bringing aid and all that sort of thing, and a huge amount of what the army does is actually fully and thoroughly peacemaking in the first place. I do think, though, that we have to search our consciences as a nation in some of the more recent wars. I think particularly in the way we got involved in Iraq, in our relations with America. I think we do have to... I'm very glad I'm not a Prime Minister. I think it must be one of the most appalling decisions for anybody to have to make, to commit people to war. And I am convinced that if we put as much effort and as much creative effort and courage into building and making peace as we do into war, we would be living in a better place.
Let's come back and finish this chat off with you, Malcolm, in just a moment. It's 12 minutes to 3.
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Bob Dylan, Blowing in the Wind. We've got one more song to play, which is a bit long. So, to play it all, we're going to have to be really quick here, Malcolm. We are more appreciative now of poetry. There was a bit of a period, I think, when everybody was looking a little bit too deep into just about nearly everything, and it became very abstract. And
I think there was a period when poetry became almost very kind of abstract and obscure and cliquey, and poets only writing for other poets, and it was all in a little kind of ivory circle by itself somewhere. I think it's recovering from that, and I think that's partly because poets, I mean, among whom I'd number myself, are trying to make it more accessible, and also, to be frank, rediscovering the beautiful old forms in rhythm and rhyme. It's like, my book Sounding the Seasons is all sonnets, and hasn't been done for a couple of 100 years, but I thought, why not? And it seems to have worked, It seems
that we got really abstract and a bit arty after the 60s and through the 70s. But, of course, we've just played one of the world's greatest ever poets, Bob Dylan.
Absolutely. And that's where poetry went. When the sort of arty, cliquey university poetry was kind of disappearing up itself, nobody was reading it, the real poets were out there on the stages. Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen, Neil Young. They were actually making the poetry. And that, Blowing in the Wind, I chose it, of course, because of the day we're in the very issue we're just discussing now. How many times must those cannonballs fly before they're forever banned? that song has never ceased to be relevant from the day he wrote it.
What's happening on Thursday night?
So Thursday night, I'm giving a public lecture, a free lecture up in Durham at the Leach Hall in St John's. And it's called Imagination Bodies Forth, Art and Incarnation. And that's from a great bit in Shakespeare where he says, as imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown, the poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. And it's going to be a talk about how art, and especially poetry, needs to be rooted and local and particular and open and hospitable. And I'm going to link that with the priest side of to what it might mean for people to say the Word was made flesh, that God didn't stay up in some abstract, airy-fairy sort of self-referential heaven, but was bodied forth and made himself a bit more available.
Okay, so that's at St John's.
That's at St John's College in Durham on the South Bailey there. It's at 7:30 and it's a free event. So
if you're around in Durham, get yourself along and say hello to Malcolm as well. We can see more of your work and also the books and everything, because in this day and age you have your own website.
I have a blog, but, which is very good for getting poetry out there, and I kind of read the poems on it. So you can get to it at malcolmguite.com. I mean, it's a WordPress blog, so if you Google my name, which is Guite, spelt like guide, only with a T, you'll get it straight away, and all the poetry's on there.
Well, thank you for coming in and talking to us. Good luck with Thursday. Thank you for sharing some poetry with us this afternoon and talking a bit about the other life as well, if you want, away from the words, in the church. Final song, The Water Boys, The Whole of the Moon. Why?
Well, that's pure poetry from start to finish. And I saw the crescent, you saw the whole of the moon. I think that's what poetry is trying to get us, is, as it were, get us past the eclipsed and crescent bits of the way we see and give us back the whole of the moon.
Thanks for talking to us, and thank you for coming in. Malcolm, been a pleasure.
Thank you.
I pictured a rainbow. You held it in your hands. I had flashes. You saw